Would you pray for us, please? Bow your heads, please.
Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you that we get to come to Indeed and learn more about you and our school. And I pray for the rest of the day today in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, sir. Okay. Thank you for bringing leaves, and I brought you guys some very specific leaves that I want to show you some specific things on. So we'll be spending our lab time today on those. Okay? So hopefully everybody's okay. But you can put the leaves down for right now. And go ahead, and if you don't have it out already, get your Uplands book out, your Florida's Uplands, and open up to this week's chapter, which is chapter 6, Temperate, Hardwoods, and Hammocks, and it starts on page 89. We are doing temperate hardwoods today, but first let's quickly review, okay? You ready? Okay. So you tell me, what kind of ecosystem is that? We've already studied this.
Pine wood.
It's a pine wood. There were several names we could use. Does anybody remember what'd you say? I can't hear you.
Grassland.
It's a pine grassland, yes. This is also known as a flatwood. Remember that? A pine flatwood. And some people used to call them pine barrens, which they're not barren at all. But that's what people used to call them. Let's see if we can get you to work. There we go. What is that? Now that's different. This one you see in South Florida a lot. There's less trees. What ecosystem is that, which is up in North Florida? Good. That's a high pine grassland. Good. A lot of you said it. That's excellent. All right. So remember, this is more what we see down here. These are slash pines, and they are a pine flatwood, and the trees are more sparse. Whereas in the high pine grassland, it's strictly the longleaf pine is the predominant tree, and there are more trees, and there's a lot of wiregrass in between. Remember that? Okay. What's that called? Prairie. That's a prairie. Very good. And it is in the same chapter with the pine flatwood because they have a lot of similarities, even though the prairie, by definition, doesn't have any trees or very few trees. What kind of ecosystem is that? That's a scrub. And why does that look like a desert in the middle of what should be normal Florida? What did it used to be? Very good. That was an island. It was a beach. As the sea level came down after the flood and during the ice age, these were areas that were islands because they're higher elevation-wise than other places around them, and therefore that's where a beach set up. And then as the sea level continued to go down and then stabilize, we end up with these islands, but there's no longer water around them. Now there's land around them, and we got these weird scrub environments in these places in Florida that they you don't expect them to be. That is called the Yellow River. It is it's an actual Florida and river, a river in Florida. I can talk Florida and river, you like that? It's an actual river in Florida up in the Panhandle. It's called the Yellow River, like the one in China, but I think the reason it's called the Yellow River is when you get pictures of it, it kind of looks yellow, and I think it's the clay underneath it that makes it look yellow. I was trying to figure that out. When I looked it up, on the internet, it kept telling me about the Yellow River in China. It didn't tell me about the one in Florida. But anyway, when we have a river or a stream gully, what kind of underneath sediments do we have predominantly? Clay, very good. And I honestly think the clay is what gives this the color that they call it the Yellow River, because the water in this river is very clean from what I've seen. What's underneath this kind of landscape? What do we have? If not clay, what do we have here? Sand, because when you have lakes and ponds, you usually have a large predominance of sand underneath it. And that's a spring up. Okay, and you got limestone under your springs, your sinks, and your caves, which actually in the next chapter, we're going to be focusing in on that because we're finally going to get to rocklands. And so we'll be looking at those kind of things. What's that called? A snag. And what type of birds like to get into the snags to make their homes? Woodpeckers. We see a lot of woodpeckers in there. What's that called?
Tip-up mound.
Very good. That's a tip-up mound. And you're reading this week, I don't know if you noticed, but it said that this makes a certain type of micro-topography. Remember, topography is the lay of the land. Micro means small. So this makes up a micro-topography, a small looking at the lay of the land, because what it'll do is eventually this will end up becoming a mound. So there's a little mound and then a dip. And that is its own little ecosystem where a lot of plants and animals will take up residence there. So it's pretty cool, a tip-up mound. What kind of bird is that?
Cardinal.
Cardinal. Everybody say cardinal.
Cardinal.
Cardinal, and that's a male cardinal. You're absolutely right. So who's that? That's the lady cardinal. Okay, who's that?
Blue jay.
Blue jay. Who's that?
Flying squirrel.
Good job. Okay, who's that? That's just a regular squirrel. Everybody's like, squirrel. Okay. So if we want to be specific, you can either call it a gray squirrel, a tree squirrel, or if you want to get real fancy, an arboreal squirrel, because arbor means tree, so an arboreal means it lives in the trees. So anytime you hear that word, don't freak out. It just means they live in the trees, okay? So that's a gray squirrel. So what's that? Fox squirrel. Good job. And remember, all of them actually require a hardwood somewhere in their life. Even though these guys like the grasslands, the pine grasslands, remember, what do they do in the hardwoods? What do they need the hardwoods for? Do you remember? They do that, but what else do they need the hardwoods for? You don't remember, to make their nest for their babies. Oh, did you say that, Cameron? I couldn't hear you. It's to make their nest for their babies. So they actually, even though they do the pine cones and they live in the pine grasslands, they actually need the hardwoods close by so that they can have their nest and make their babies, make their nest and have their babies, I'm gonna get this, in the trees. So that's what they need it for. What's that? Good. That is a pileated woodpecker. Everybody say pileated woodpecker.
Pileated.
And that's the big one. And if you hear it pileated, I think that's okay too, because I looked it up and they said that either pronunciation was okay, so I just kind of decided on the pileated. But if you hear it the other way, it's okay. And that's that one that makes that weird sound that sounds like you're in the jungle. So that's the pileated. Once again, these are large woodpeckers. What about that? That's a female. That's a red cockaded woodpecker. Remember, they're only about this big. And I have a student on the other coast tell me there's a downy woodpecker, and I looked it up, and I didn't get you a picture today, but it's just a little smaller than this, but its face looks fuzzier. And I think that's why they call it a downy woodpecker. That's the one I see all the time, and I mean, I see this one all the time, so I decided to put him in here. They call it a red-bellied woodpecker, and I'm looking at its belly going, wait a second, there's no red on its belly anywhere. But the red-headed woodpecker has a full red head, which I didn't get you a picture of that one because I don't see those very often. These I see constantly. So, and they kind of make this chuck, chuck, chuck sound. And I always thought it was the squirrels, and then I realized it was the woodpecker as he's going by. So, but that's your red-bellied woodpecker, even though it's on his head, not on his belly, okay? Just so at least you know a couple of the woodpeckers. The pileated, the red cockaded woodpecker, and that's the red-bellied woodpecker. My dad calls these sapsuckers because they get into his grove and they drill into his grapefruits and stuff, and then he feels like you can't eat them because they're full of holes, which I see what he's saying, so then he feeds them to the cows. But anyway, so he gets upset with these guys and calls them sapsuckers. What's that? Gopher tortoise, very good. How about that? Box turtle, very good. Anybody remember that one? Mud turtle. Everybody say mud turtle.
Mud turtle.
Mud turtle. That's a little tiny mud turtle. How about that? That's a common garter snake. How about that? That's an eastern garter snake. Rat snake. You know, I didn't bring you a picture of a rat snake, but do you remember the rat snake climbing up the tree in the first chapter that we read? On Friday, my daughter came over with the grandkids to ride the horses. And so after the ride, the kids wanted to go in and see my other daughter because that's their Aunt Lena. They call her Mama Lena. So they go up and they knock on the door. They open the door and a snake falls off of the top of the door into the house. Now, Lena is the one child of my three that freaks out on stuff like that. Ah, a snake is in my house, you know what I'm saying? And the guy, it's about that long. It was a little baby rat snake. And so I just got done riding the horses, so I had on leather gloves and I had on my riding boots still, cowboy boots. I ride Western. And so my daughter's trying to do it, and it's striking because it's scared to death. And these little guys will strike at you because they think you're trying to eat them. And I understand that entirely. So I said, let me do it. I've got gloves on. So I took the little snake and popped him out of the house, you know, just kind of whoosh, out of the house. And then when he was on the front porch, I took my foot and just whew, off the porch. But we had a little fun with that. My daughter says she's not using that door anymore. Because that happened to me. That was my old house. And when I lived there, I tend to be fast moving at all times, so I kind of go through doors as I open them, and that was a mistake that day because a snake hit me on the head. And there's a little lip above the door that my husband left to hook the hurricane shutters to because he felt like it was too hard to take it down and put it back, and nobody sees our front door because it's headed towards, I don't know, about 1,000 acres of woods. Nobody lives back there. So he never took it down. And I think that's where the snakes are getting. So I learned on that front door not to just walk through it. I learned to open the door and then walk through it. It's the only door I do that to. I forgot to tell my daughter. So anyway, it was a bit of a thrill for her. That's an eastern garter snake. So that's the common, that's the eastern. And the rat snakes do climb, and that's why we found this baby rat snake up on top, because they can climb a wall, a stucco wall. Just like the wall of a house. They can just climb right up it, which is pretty weird when you think about it. So anyway, what's that? Very good. And what are they? Bobwhite quail. And which one's the lady, left or right? Left is the lady. Okay, what are those? Salamanders. What's that? That's a white peacock butterfly. Very good. Remember, they're little bitty and they do the flowers in the grass. So you'll find them on the grass. What's that? Sandhill crane. Very good. How about that? It is a type of vulture. It's a caracara. It's a crested caracara. Everybody say crested caracara.
Crested caracara.
Very good. And it is a type of a buzzard. You're absolutely right. I guess we'll have to do the other buzzards at some point, but this is the prettiest one. So, oh, dear. Okay, what's that? Yes, that's a lizard, but that's a Florida scrub lizard. They're specifically found in the scrubs. I just think he's pretty. What's that?
Scrub jay.
Good. Florida's only endemic bird from what the book says, the scrub jay. Do you guys remember what that is? Scrub balm. Very good. And it's a scrub flower. It's a scrub balm. And so that's the one that has both the male and the female flowers, but they don't have both parts. So remember, anybody ever remember what they're called if they only have one or the other, not both? Very good. Imperfect flowers. Very, very good. And so remember, those guys have a specific little bee that pollinates them. And actually, let me just stall here for just a sec. In today's chapter, it talked about dispersing the seeds. So dispersal agents. Remember I told you guys about dispersal agents and that we ourselves could be dispersal agents if the stickers or whatever get to us and then we drop them someplace else. And the birds are a dispersal agent for a lot of these. So in this case, the bee is the pollinator. What was that called? Do you guys remember?
Worm lizard.
Yeah, Florida worm lizard. He's a weird one. And what's the general name for these?
Blue-tailed lizard.
It's not a lizard.
Snake.
It's a skink. Everybody say skink.
Skink.
Now, we have a lot of different colored skinks in Florida. I always thought they were just black because that's what I saw mostly. And then they have all the colors of the rainbow when the light hits them. But then I started finding brown ones, which are gorgeous. They're like chocolate brown and they shine all the colors of the rainbow. I like chocolate, can you tell? And then these are real pretty. I haven't seen the blue-tailed mole skink, but they're just variations within the skink kind, and there's all sorts of different color variations. And we'll end up seeing that in a lot of different animals. Remember, that was the sand skink. Yeah, and remember they said he had vestigial legs, and vestigial just meant that evolutionists think they're leftovers from evolution and they're no longer functional. But I'm going to camp a little bit on natural selection with you today because it seems to keep coming up, so I want to make sure you really understand it. But I said to you that there were probably these skinks both in the scrub and out of the scrub, but outside of the scrub, its little legs couldn't move it fast enough to possibly get away from predators, so they'd be picked off easier, whereas those that lived in the scrub could slither through the sand, almost like swimming through the sand in the scrub, and survive to reproduce. And that's why we see them in the scrub, but we don't see them outside the scrub. And it's because they were naturally selected for within the scrub. We'll come back to that. Does anybody remember what that's called?
No-legged glass.
It's a no-legged something. Okay, it is a legless lizard is what it's called. Katie was on the right track. She said no-legged lizard. It's a legless lizard, and this particular one was called a glass snake. Excuse me, what's it called? A glass lizard? Yeah, a glass lizard. And the reason they call it a glass lizard is it can lose its tail really, really easily. And it breaks off and then grows back, which you can see in the picture there. Now, does anybody remember what kind of snakes these are? These are king snakes. And these are 3 different colored king snakes, and they actually come in more colors than this. The scarlet king snake is the one that looks very much like a coral snake. That's a red king snake there. And so we have these variations within the king snakes, and we're going to come back to that. What makes all those little mounds? I always thought it was moles, but they're pocket gophers that do that. Apparently the moles don't make as big a mounds as the pocket gopher does. So I know, they're only about the size of a hamster. So, and I'm hoping everybody knows what a hamster is. Okay, so they're small, and moles are about the size of a mouse. The first mole I saw, I was like, I expected it to be squirrel size, and it was the size of a mouse. I'm going, what happened here, you know? Okay, so let's do what we're doing today. Temperate hardwoods. And so we are on page 89 in your book. And did anybody remember what the difference was between a hardwood and a softwood? Probably not. It's okay. I'll just go over it with you. Oh, in your reading, in your workbook, we were learning about the different areas in a forest, because a hardwood hammock is actually a forest, isn't it? If I were to say forest to you, what picture comes in your mind?
Trees.
Trees, thank you. A forest is a community that has a lot of trees. And so most forests that we think of are on land, because then if you see a bunch of trees in water, it's a swamp. But it's still a type of forest, isn't it? Because it's full of trees. And so it's a treed community. But let's focus on land for just a minute here. The scientists forestry people have divided it into parts. The emergent layer is the part that's growing literally above everything else, like in reaching up out of the top. Whereas the canopy is just the top layer. And the canopy, remember, if it's a closed canopy, it actually closes out the light in the ecosystem. The understory is right below the canopy, so it's anything that's growing in that area right below the canopy. The shrub layer is kind of what we would think of as the bushes and stuff. And then there's a layer missing here, actually. The herb layer would be like the lichen and things like that are growing on the ground, and then the forest floor itself, okay? So those would be the divisions. Now, in a hardwood forest, you have hardwood trees, so we need to know what the difference is between softwoods and hardwoods. And the book tells us that the softwoods are basically conifers, evergreens, conifers, things that produce cones like pine trees and things like that, okay? And also, well here, it's on page 89, it says softwoods include pines and other conifers. Most are true evergreens. They maintain their leaves, which are needles, all year. They shed only a few from day to day and add new growth at the branch tips in the spring. Whereas hardwoods are broad-leafed, and they are flowering trees, and most of them are deciduous. What does that mean that they're deciduous? Very good. They lose their leaves once a year. So in other words, a hardwood usually will have a broad, flat leaf. And this is the broadest, flattest leaf I have with me right now, but that's a broad, flat leaf. Compared to, these are cypress leaves, okay, very thin. These are palm leaves, palm frond, very thin. So although these are evergreens, aren't they? Just like your pine tree has the long skinny ones. These are evergreens, but the hardwoods have a large flat leaf usually, and they're deciduous. They're going to lose their leaves at least once a year. Then it tells us there that a forest is a large community of trees and shrubs, and a hammock is used for a non-pine forest in Florida. And it says that a hammock can include some cabbage palms and red cedars, but it's a non-pine stand of trees, okay, would be called a hammock. And so notice here once again, the hardwoods are flowering plants. They do have broad deciduous leaves, okay? If you actually looked at the cutaway of these two woods, the softwood actually looks different than the hardwood does. Now, not to say that people don't use pine to build things, they do. But it's still soft compared to the hardwood, apparently. Now, you look at that tree and its leaves, and you tell me, is that a hardwood or a softwood?
Hardwood.
Okay, why do you say it's a hardwood? The leaves, good. Big, flat, broad leaves. Very good. What about those? Softwood, because they have needles, don't they? And they're an evergreen. What about that tree? That's a hardwood, because it's got the big, flat, broad leaves. What about those? Softwood, because they have the long, thin leaves, and they're an evergreen, aren't they? Okay, so I just want to make sure you could kind of distinguish between them. So the first part of your temperate hardwood hammocks in your book, turn over to page 90, please. It shows you where they are. Now, on the first page, and I showed you this last week because we were doing the soil last week, in a hardwood hammock, there'll be areas, if they're on a slope, where there's xeric soil up at the top where it's draining very easily. Then you get down closer to where the water is and it'll be mesic soil, so that would be a mesic forest. And then down here where it's constantly underwater and you've got hydric soil like a swamp, then that would be your hydric area of the forest. So we have these different types of forests. Remember the pine grassland, the high pine grassland and the flatwoods and the scrub, all of those were fire-dependent communities, weren't they? And when the fire blasted through there, not only does it get rid of some of the competition, but what else does the fire do for that ecosystem? Puts the nutrients back into the soil, so it actually turns it into what is like fertilizer, doesn't it? The ash acts almost as fertilizer. Well, in the hardwood forest, there's a different agent that takes care of putting the nutrients back in the soil. Does anybody remember? Yes, sir. The leaves that have to be broken down, you're right. But does what?
Fungi.
Fungi, that's right. Remember, in a hardwood, and thank you for answering, in a hardwood situation, the fire does not go into the hardwood hammock because it's too moist. It's got wet leaves on the ground. It tends to stay moister. Even in a xeric one, it tends to stay moister. And so the fire usually won't blast through there. So the thing that recycles the leaves and the dead things and puts nutrients back into the soil are different types of fungi. Now that's a mushroom. That's just a fruiting body of a fungi. That's showing you some shelf fungus, which are actually the fruiting body. If I showed you an orange tree and we looked at the orange would be the fruiting body, and then the tree is the rest of it, right? These are fruiting bodies. The fungus is actually a little thread-like cells that go into the wood. This is the fruiting body, but if you look underneath it, there's little thread-like cells that go into the ground, and that is actually the fungus, not this part. This is like pointing at an orange and going, that's an orange tree. It's not, is it? So the mushroom is the fruiting body like the orange. The actual fungus is the very fine thread-like cells that are at the base that are in the ground. Let's see, hang on. I picked some this morning for the biology class out of my brother's neighbor's yard. I didn't figure he'd mind. Let's see if there's any. God bless you. See, this one I got a lot of dirt with it, but you can just kind of see. See these here, which we would have thought of maybe would be roots? Those aren't roots. That's the actual fungus. This is the orange. This is the fruiting body, okay, that makes the seeds, which are spores in this case, okay? Okay, so, and let's see. So that's a mushroom. That's a lichen, which is a, excuse me, that's not a lichen. That's a shelf fungus. Okay, so it actually is the fruiting body of a fungus that eats dead wood. That's just a real pretty stand of mushrooms. Some of these fungus are real pretty. And Hannah, in the second period class, sent me these pictures because she found these in her yard this week. And right down here, you can kind of see the fungi that it was a part of, that it was the fruiting body for. Anyway, so that's a difference. So where the pinelands and the scrubs had fire to put the nutrients back into the soil, the temperate hardwood has the fungi, and we're going to do a fungus lab. I think it's next week. So watch your syllabus because you'll need to try to bring in some mold and stuff. Tell Mom not to clean the refrigerator without giving you the mold, okay? And I think that's next week. Yes, don't throw it away. Save it. Okay, yeah, science class. Oh dear, okay. Yeah, save it and we'll use it, all right? Yes, Mrs. Frady's and the weird stuff I have you bring in, I know. Okay, let's see. So this is a picture of a xeric hardwood, and the book was talking about that xeric hardwoods were made up of laurel oak and live oak, and please notice that they have a lot of Spanish moss on them. This is a hydric forest, and the book said the hydric forests in Florida tended to have cabbage palms in them, as well as red bay and red cedar. That's a red cedar, just in case. And, you know, I meant to bring you some cedar leaves, but I did bring you cypress, which are similar. They're a scaled leaf, so we'll look at those today. It's a very different type of a leaf. The first type, I thought I had a, okay, temperate hardwoods. Let's see. That is a beech magnolia forest, and it is a fully mature forest. The beech trees are the ones that have these horizontal layers, and the magnolias tend to stand up farther. And that's how they catch the sun, is they have all these different layers of leaves. What kind of bird is that? You guys don't know. That is the Florida state bird. And a lot of us really feel strongly that we need to change the Florida state bird. That is a northern mockingbird. And why, out of all the birds we have in Florida, someone would choose a northern mockingbird as our state bird just seems really insane. A lot of us think it should be the pelican, the spoonbill, the flamingo. Pick one, something more Florida. The great blue heron would be amazing. But instead, they picked the northern mockingbird. I mean, I like mockingbirds, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't scream Florida, does it? Whereas like a flamingo, everybody would associate with Florida, you know what I'm saying? So it just seems like we should pick, or a pelican, something different.
All over. We found a baby one abandoned.
Oh yeah, yeah, mockingbirds, they're cool. They can sing, they can basically mimic anything you want, but they just don't scream Florida to me. But everybody, that's a mockingbird. Everybody say mockingbird.
Mockingbird!
And it is the Florida state bird, so you should know it, that is our Florida state bird. Aha, this is where I was trying to go. I asked your moms to have you print this map out. If you have it, yay. Go ahead and look at this map. And I'm going to go through this quickly, but this is to reflect what's going on in your textbook on page 90, okay? Just so you know. Shh. Okay, now listen. This tells you a lot of things. Look at this. Beaches and dunes are in the orange. And so it's funny that you've got beaches and dunes in the middle of the state. So guess what that is? That's a scrub. Oh, see, it's orange. That's a scrub. And here's a scrub, okay? And so we've got beaches and dunes. We've got scrubs, which are the old beaches and dunes. This pink is pine flatwoods. So here you've got, look at most of Florida, we have pine flatwoods, don't we? Okay, does everybody see the pink here? And then you see it's got pine flatwoods. We've got them all over the place. Upland mixed forest, notice those are way up here is where you have the upland mixed forests. And then scrub forests would be these scrub ecosystems. The yellow are sand hills, and so these are very sandy, probably don't have a lot of forests on them. But if you'll notice in your book, there's different type of forests up here, there's differing types of forests down the middle of the state, and it's because of the elevation, and that's on, if you've got your book open to page 90, you'll see it there also. How these are grouped together, and they're grouped together depending on how high the land is, what the elevation of the land is, literally. So we have these differing forests. Now, the book said that the temperate forests are basically up here, the temperate hardwood hammocks, and the tropical forests are down here. And in between, in peninsular Florida, we have a mixture. We have some temperate hardwoods and we have some tropical hardwoods. So we have a mixture as you get into the central portion of Florida, okay? But the upward portion has a lot of these interesting upland mixed forests. And once again, it has to do with the elevation in Florida as to why we see the different ones that we see. But it also has to do with the climate. Remember, when you're upstate, when you're in the panhandle, it's in the temperate zone. You've got 4 real seasons where the water freezes in the wintertime. Wow. You know, so it's different, and that's part of the reason why we have different trees up there and plants, because it's an actual 4-season situation, that kind of a climate. I heard Katie was saying that leaves are weeds. Let me explain something to you. In Florida, I know we as homeowners don't like weeds, but weeds are very important. They're called pioneer plants. And what they do is once an area is cleared, if nothing grew there, then the wind and the rain would blow everything away and the soil would disappear. And that has happened in the United States at times. And then there were horrible famines afterwards, because if you blow away the topsoil, you can't grow any kind of a crop, so you don't eat. Does everybody understand that? So what weeds jobs are to English is hard today, and it's the only language I speak, so that's pretty scary. But what happens is the weeds come in and they start growing in these areas very quickly until other plants can come in and start to grow that are slower growing. And so what the weeds do as pioneer plants is they pioneer an area. They hold the ground in place until other plants can come in and grow in those areas. I never thought of weeds as having any value until I learned about this, and I was like, oh, so they really do something. They're not just irritating and waiting for me to pull them out. Okay, so the weeds come in first, and those are your pioneer plants, and then the other species will start to come in and grow, and then eventually when the big trees can get fully grown and mature, then those weeds will disappear because they'll block out the sunlight. Okay, so there's a progression there that it goes through in a forest. And the book told us that where people have cleared the land, so let's say they cleared it to make a farm, or they cleared it to plant it in pine because they can sell that crop and they can also write off on their taxes. The land is agricultural land. Just in case you're wondering why somebody would do this, I'm explaining it to you. Okay? So if a person bought a big piece of land and it was a raw piece of land in Florida, you and I are learning how that raw piece of land actually has inherent value just as it is. But what a person needs to do, because the state will tax them on it, is they will try to make that land so that they get a tax exemption. Because ag tax exemptions are pretty good. Agriculture, when I say ag, I'm talking agriculture. So they'll either make it into farmland or they will clear it and plant it. Well, what happens when you clear it and then you let it lay fallow, which means you're not using it anymore, and fire's not allowed to blast through there, we're told that it builds up a pine, oak, hickory forest. And I'm, as a South Floridian, go, what's a pine, oak, hickory forest? And when I looked at the picture, I went, oh, I see those in North Florida all the time. And you see them all through Georgia. You know, these are everywhere, okay? So when you see it, that's a pine, oak, hickory forest, and that's usually where it's been cleared and then fire hasn't been allowed to come through there. And so that grows in the place of where something was cleared. Yes, sir?
I hiked through that in Georgia.
You have? Yeah, you know, it immediately made me think of South Georgia and North Florida because that's where I've seen this, but I see it all over the place up there. Right. And, well, but it's still easier than hiking through some places. Yeah. So, yes, Cameron?
My grandparents live up in that kind of area.
Okay. So you've seen these too. And I didn't know what they were called either. But like I said, when I looked up the picture, I was like, oh, I see those all the time. So now you guys know what they are too. So when you see that, that's a pine, oak, hickory. 3 different types of trees, pine, oak, and hickory forest. Now back to the beech magnolia forest, so let's go there. Turn over to page 92 for me for just a minute. How these things, first off, they're found in North Florida. The 2 main trees are beech trees and magnolia trees, but there are at least 25 other types of trees there. And your book compared how different these are than the pine grasslands, because in the pine grasslands you basically have pine trees, wiregrass. That would be a high pine grassland, right? Pine trees, wiregrass. Or if you go to a pine flatwood, you'd have pine trees, you'd have a little bit of grass of some sort, and then you'd have lots of palmettos, right? So there's not a lot of species, but in these different hardwood hammocks, you do have a lot of different species. And the trees are much more tightly packed than in the grasslands, so there's dense shade, and therefore there's not a lot of ground cover growth. That is actually a magnolia tree. That's a really big magnolia tree. And that is a beech tree. And so the beech magnolia forest is made up of those 2 basic types of trees. The light that gets through here, okay, let's back up and play with light for just a minute. The light that we see is in the visible spectrum, which is called Roy G. Biv. How many of you have never heard of Roy G. Biv before? Okay, so everybody's heard of it at some point. So what we can see is between the red end of the spectrum to the violet end. So I'm going to do it Roy G. Biv style because it's not there, it's backwards. But this is red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Yesterday on the way here it was raining and I saw a beautiful rainbow and you could very clearly see this spectrum there. Okay, so this is the visible spectrum. There is light that it has higher energy than this, but we can't see it. It's called ultraviolet. There is light that has longer wavelengths or lower frequency than this, and that's called infrared. and we can't see that. It's heat and radio waves and TV and stuff like that, okay? So there's a lot of light that the sun makes that we can't see, but this is the visible spectrum that we can see. Now, the reason things look the color that they do is because of how the light is reflected to our eye. So let me show you. I've got on a green dress here. So what happens is the white light has Roy G. Biv. It has red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. When it hits my dress, the green dye absorbs all the colors except for green. So it absorbs Roy, it absorbs Biv, but it doesn't absorb green. It reflects the green back to my eye, and therefore I see a green dress. Maya has an orange shirt on, so when it looks orange to me, so we're going to go with orange. When the light hits it, it absorbs the red, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, but the orange is reflected back to our eye, and therefore we see it as orange. Does everyone understand that? So the reason a leaf looks green is because it absorbs every color. It absorbs Roy and it absorbs Biv, but it doesn't absorb the green. It reflects the green back to our eye. Now that means plants can't live on green light because it's the only light they can't use. That's why they look green. They reflect it back to our eye. So if you put plants in a green room, they'll die because they're not getting what they need. Now, when you get one of these closed canopy forests that we're talking about, the light doesn't penetrate down to the lower layers, and that's why you don't see a lot of things growing on the floor of the forest, and the things that do grow there, the book said are good at growing in blue light, because apparently after it's reflected the green, some of the blue is able to still get through, and some of these plants are actually designed so that they can live on a very meager amount of light, which is blue light. Also, we were told that as these guys grew, that the magnolias and the beeches were slower to start growing, but they would keep growing and eventually get higher and taller and bigger than the other trees, and they would close out the top of the canopy so that other trees didn't have as much of a chance underneath them. So those 25 other species are trying really hard to keep up to get underneath these things, okay? Because they're kind of blocking out as much of the sun as they can. Now, remember, fires would open up the ability for new trees to grow in the other communities that we talked about, but here we don't have fires. Does anybody remember what happens to allow new trees to start growing in these areas? What'd you say? Well, the fungus breaks things down. You're absolutely right. But look on the gray box. Are you going to tell me, Delaney?
I forgot what it's called, but it's when the old trees die and the little trees
Good. Very good. Gap succession. Gap succession, Delaney said it. It's where the old trees die, and as the old trees die, then there's an area of light that will be allowed, and therefore then seedlings can start growing up. Now remember, this said in here that the magnolia and the beech tree actually have a chemical defense against anything growing beneath them, that the mulch that their leaves make actually kills off any other plants that are trying to grow underneath them. And it said that the beech tree actually, their decaying leaves will release chemicals that stop the growth of anything but their own seedlings. Isn't that weird? So they actually put out a chemical defense that stops other things from growing right underneath them. Also, a magnolia is a broad-leafed evergreen, which means it never completely loses its leaves. When it's making new leaves, it'll literally push out the old brown leaf with a new green leaf, so it doesn't ever just lose all its leaves like an actual deciduous tree. Therefore, it's considered an evergreen hardwood, okay, because it's got a broad leaf. The beech tree is different. The beech tree is tardily deciduous. Now remember, we said deciduous means it loses its leaves once a year. Well, the beech tree doesn't lose its leaves until everybody else is starting to get, everybody else has lost their leaves in the fall. So the beech tree keeps its leaves and it does its growing and photosynthesizing. And then at the end of winter, it will actually drop its leaves and get its new leaves. And it also has the new leaves coming in directly behind the old leaves. But it does lose them. It's just way later than all the other trees so that it can do its photosynthetic thing in between. Oh, and I didn't say this, so I should. The whole job of a leaf is to make food for the tree. So the leaves are distributed in such a way to get as much light as they can so that they can photosynthesize and make food for the tree. Does that make sense? So the leaves are food factories, so they have a very important job. Okay, some of the differences between these ecosystems and the other ecosystems we looked at. In the pinelands, they were very open and sunny and spacious, whereas in these hardwood hammocks, they're very closed and clogged up with branches and vines and stuff. Most of the photosynthesis in a pineland is on the ground in the grass, whereas most of the photosynthesis in these hardwood hammocks is in the canopy in the trees. Fire recycles the nutrients in the pinelands. Fungi does it in the hardwood hammocks. The fox squirrel is predominantly the squirrel you see in the pinelands, whereas the tree squirrel is more predominant in the hammocks. The great horned owl is seen more in the pinelands, whereas the barred owl is seen more in the grasslands. The red-tailed hawk is in the pinelands, and the red-shouldered hawk. Now listen, this is the difference. Those are your fungi, once again. Those are different Florida fungi. Bring that.
I looked.
It's not there right now.
In our yard. I don't know if it's
Okay. Yeah, it's a morel, M-O-R-E-L.
Okay. So
Yeah, and yeah, but they stink, don't they? No, it's something else. One kid brought something one year and it was like, oh, it was really bad. Anyway, so, all right, so the fungus, we already talked about that was the fox squirrel in the pineland. That's the tree squirrel that's in the hardwood hammock. This is your great horned owl, and this is your barred owl. Which one do you see in the pineland? The great horned owl, because he's got a bigger wingspan. His wingspan is, let's see, I know it's listed here somewhere, but here we go. Great horned owl, wingspan of 55 inches, guys. That is big, okay? Whereas the barred owl has a much smaller wingspan. It's a much smaller owl. And then the guy on the left is the red-tailed hawk. He has a 4-foot wingspan, okay, 48 inches, this guy. This guy is the red-shouldered hawk, and he has a 40, so a little over 3-foot wingspan. What you see here is that with the birds, in the pineland, you have bigger birds with bigger wingspans because you don't have as many trees, so they can fly through it more easily. Whereas in the temperate hammock, you have a lot of trees, so you have birds with shorter wingspans so that they can maneuver between all those trees. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why we see that. And then as we move on page 96 and 97, it talks about hardwood forests in steep head ravines. Now this is once again the Apalachicola River, but it mentions here that on these steep banks that we have, and this is the only place in Florida we have these, is up really near the Apalachicola River where we have these really steep banks. On one bank, you'll have different kind of trees than the other bank because one bank is facing north and one bank is facing south. And it actually makes a difference as to what kind of trees will grow there. But you notice all these hardwood trees up and down along these slopes, along Apalachicola. Now, it mentioned here the Steep Head Ravine, which is a weird thing. It's on page 97. And they're only up in Florida east of the Apalachicola River. But this is weird. The water doesn't cut through and make the valley like we see with the river, where the water actually cuts through the clay and makes a stream gully for the river to run through. That's not what's happened here. These steep heads, the water comes out at the bottom of the hill. And as the water comes out at the bottom of the hill caves in around it, and it takes away what's above it. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's like having a hose in the dirt at the bottom of a hill, and as you're squirting the hose from the bottom of the hill, it starts to build this valley around it because it's starting to, everything caves in where the water's flowing. Does that make sense? Okay, so a steep head ravine is where these steep heads, and it's called steep head because somebody looked at it and went, well, man, that's steep, and look, it's the head of a stream. Steep head. Seriously. I like it when it's that logical. I like when they name things like that. So that's why it's called a steep head, because it's very steep right at the head of the stream, because that's where the water's coming out. And these are the steepest places in Florida. They can be 75 to 100 feet straight down, which is really weird for Florida. And so there's a lot of cool trees that can grow in those areas. Now that is a live oak, as best I'm told. And upstate we have some live oak and laurel oak forests. And these are huge old trees, and usually they're covered in Spanish moss, which I will bring in Spanish moss for us soon to look at under the microscope. I always thought it was a moss, and in this week's chapter it says that they're bromeliads, which is a type of plant. So we're going to have to look at those under the microscope for ourselves. Yes, sir?
Where last weekend I went on camping with my dad. We're across the sandhill cranes, and they have like a forest of those trees. They're everywhere, and they have,
These.
yeah, and they have the small palmetto as well.
Yes.
It's cool because we're all learning about it, and then I just realized now I understand everything.
Cool, Cole, thank you, high five. That's the whole idea of the class, so that you guys can actually start identifying the stuff that's around you and understand it better. Thank you, Cole, that's the whole purpose. Very good. And I know, did you, no, it was in the other class. One of the young ladies also, Sophia, went camping. Her dad took her camping, and she got to see like 4 of the ecosystems up near, she went to Lake Louisa, which is about an hour from Orlando, because when she told me about it, I checked it out. And it's a state park, and it had high pine grassland scrub, it had the flatwoods. So that's cool. I'm glad you got to see some of it. That is a live oak as far as I know. There's something like 50 different species of oaks, and I do not know all of them. This is one of the things you'll see on some of these oaks. That is a resurrection fern. You knew that, good. And when it's dry, it looks like it's dead, but as soon as it rains, it comes back. So that's what it looks like when it's dry, and that's what it looks like when it comes back. Isn't that weird? So, and it's just a matter of it's waiting for the rain, but that's a cool fern that you'll see on some of these trees. This is a xeric oak forest in Central Florida, which your book talks about. And that's showing you some of the epiphytes, which are the air plants that grow on them. And I would consider Spanish moss a type of epiphyte because it is a plant that grows on top of another plant. Oh, I know one thing I missed. On page 97, I do apologize. I thought I had more ravine pictures, steephead ravine pictures for you. And I know I did them, which means they must be on my computer at home. So I don't build these talks in a laptop. I'd go out of my mind. I have two monitors and my desktop, and I'm constantly working from one to the other to build these. These are not easy to put these talks together. You have to have that set up. If you're building PowerPoint presentations like extensively, you need one for the internet and you need the other for the presentation so that you're grabbing things and putting it there. Does that make sense? So I don't build these in a laptop, no way. And I apologize. Anyway, on page 97, there's the peninsular effect. Basically what that means is as you go down the peninsula of Florida, you have less and less varieties within your species, not only of plants, but also of animals. And I think it's because you have less different ecosystems. And we saw that on that map that I showed you, and we're going to use that map a lot, I hope. So there's less different types of ecosystems, and therefore there's less different species, and they call that the peninsular effect. On page 100, you see the torreya plant, which is also known as gopher wood in the picture, figure 6-8. And this is actually found up near those steephead ravines up in North Florida. Notice it says that their range is now limited exclusively to the east side of the Apalachicola River near Bristol. That's where the steephead ravines are also, is to the east side of the Apalachicola River. That's where you find all of the steephead ravines. And so this tree was supposed to be extinct, and the evolutionists believed it to be extinct, but now they have found them, and they're just in a very small area up there in North Florida between us and Georgia, and they grow in places that are between 35 and 100 feet above sea level, so you can see why they're not here. And they're usually above a stream because they like it to be moist, and so that's considered an ancient type of evergreen plant that's found up there. And then, let's see, I wanted to make sure we covered a mast year, which is on page 104. There are certain years, and it doesn't say in the book how often, but what a mast year is, M-A-S-T, there are certain years that, like, let's pick the oak tree, that the oak tree will just make all sorts of acorns, whole bunch more than what they normally do, and that's called a mast year. And we're told that the mast years are used by the animals. They'll come in knowing it's a mast year, and they'll gorge themselves on the acorns when there's a mast year. So apparently these different trees have mast years. It says here, a mast year is one in which a population of trees, frequently oaks, produces a much larger crop of seeds than the average. And so a lot of the animals benefit from that. Did you guys check out the spadefoot frog? And did you get why they call it a spadefoot? It actually digs a hole with his back feet. He's got spurs on his back feet, and then he will burrow into the mud and all you see is his eyes. So I thought that was pretty cool. I've never seen one of those. And then we have all these birds here on page 105 that migrate through Florida. And so maybe some of you have seen some of those. I haven't seen a lot of those, but they're very pretty. And then, let's see, we have the mesic hardwoods. Okay, so I think that was it. So let's go ahead and put your book away and get your lab out, please. If you don't have your lab, get a piece of paper out. You're going to need extra paper anyway today, guys. So get out some paper because you're not going to get all these leaves on that small lab. So get out a couple pieces of paper to work on also. All right, first off, the job of leaves. And I brought one big one just to make a point. The job of leaves, once again, is to photosynthesize. They are making food from light. So the green pigment in plants is called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is the pigment, which is a color that catches the sunlight and allows the plant to make sugars out of it. And then those sugars are burned by our cells and even other plant cells to make little batteries called ATPs, which keep us alive. So this is a very important process. Now I want you to notice plant leaves can come in, God bless you, all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And so it's helpful to learn to start to look at what some of the differences are. Now in this last chapter that we had, we heard that there were cabbage palm trees. We've seen over and over again that palmettos will grow into an area where the fire has been kept out. I wanted to show you the difference between a palmetto and a cabbage palm leaf. So everybody has one of each of these on your desk. Take a minute as a group and look at the two of them and see if you can tell me how you could distinguish which of these two plants or tree is growing in a particular area just by looking at the leaves that are coming up. And so get a good look and try to compare them and see what the differences are so that you can determine. There's one simple difference. There's one simple difference. Okay, does anybody see a difference? Did you let him look? No, besides that. Cameron.
That there's threads on one?
No, that's a good guess, but that would happen to any of them after time. Does anybody see there's a real distinct difference that's very easy. Yes, Zach?
One like fans out and one just goes like...
Oh, that's a good guess, but there's something real definite that you can look at. Delaney?
One is sharper than the other. It's harder?
Sharper.
Sharper, like the edges of the
Oh, the edges, that's true.
What's harder?
But I don't want to cut myself to figure it out. You can eyeball it. You guys don't see it.
Color?
I was trying to give you a chance, but if you don't, look at the very end of the stem where the leaves start and compare the very end of the stem and where the leaves start. Look at the base of the stem. This one has a point, this one doesn't. Do you see the point? No point. Palmettos do not have a point. Cabbage palm trees have a point. That way when they're coming up in your yard, you can decide whether you want to kill it or not. I hate to sound like that, but it's true. So a cabbage palm, which is also known as the sable palm, and it's a Florida state tree, has a point where the leaves come in. Notice this does not have the point. Now personally, it's my hypothesis that these are variation within kind. I think that cabbage palms and palmetto bushes may actually be just variations within kind. If you look at the stem of a palmetto, you can see very great similarities to a cabbage palm. And so, and yes, you're right about the palmettos. These are immature leaves. That's why they don't have the saw blades on the sides. And I did that intentionally because I didn't want any of you getting cut. Now this is not a cabbage palm frond. This looks like an areca palm frond to me, but it could be another type. There's several types of ornamental palms. But you notice this is one leaf. This is one leaf, and this is a compound leaf. So it is a compound leaf, remember, has a bunch of leaves on one stem. This is a tiny compound leaf, but you see how this one leaf is made up of a bunch of leaflets. Yes, so compound leaves are one leaf that's made up of a bunch of leaflets, whereas these guys are just individual leaves, aren't they? Okay? So let me give you this back.
What would this one be?
That is the whorled, it is a compound leaf. That's good. This is a mini Scheffalera, and that is a whorled arrangement. Notice in the middle it says that the different arrangements that the leaves can be done on the branch are whorled, which goes around, alternate, which goes, they alternate going down, and the other one is opposite. These are opposite. This is an opposite leaf arrangement even within this compound leaf. You see how the leaflets come out directly across from one another? That's called opposite. Whereas notice this one, they're not directly across from each other. They alternate going up the stem. Okay, this one goes around in a circle. So that's that central picture. Those are the three different arrangements that you can have there. And then I did give you one that has whorled leaf arrangement, and they're small because they were easy to carry, but each of you have a piece that looks like this. Notice the leaves are arranged around in circles around the stem. That's the whorled arrangement. Okay, whorled, W-H-O-R-L-E-D, whorled, okay, around it. And that's very common in tropical areas. You won't find these as much upstate as you do down here. We do find a lot of plants down here that have the whorled arrangement. Some of the plants can have very strange, that's a compound leaf, okay? But some of them can have very strange, my dad, as I'm picking these, he's going, why are you picking those? I go, I need them to show the students, they're so weird. But you can have really strange arrangements. And I got these from the sea grape trees outside this morning. And as far as I know, sea grapes are a native tree. And this is called orbicular. It's the shape of a circle or an orbit. And so the shape of this type of leaf is called orbicular because it's actually round. I want you to notice something else. I put a grapevine piece on your table. These are named for different things. We just looked at the leaf arrangement. We saw that the leaf arrangement could either be opposite, okay, when they're right across from each other, they're opposite. If one is taking turns going like this, it's alternate, because they're alternating, They're alternating, and this is opposite. Alternating down, and then if the leaves go all the way around, it's called whorled. If you still have any of your leaves where you can tell what the stem was as far as the arrangement on the plant, go ahead and write that. And then I would like you to take at least 5 to 7 of your leaves, and do you guys know how to put it under the paper, and you take a pencil or something and you do a rubbing? So do a rubbing of it, unless you're just really good and then you can just draw the shape, that's fine, okay? But we already saw that some of them, like the one had a really straight, really round shape, and the grape, I'm not sure what that thing's called. The grape seeds have more of a shape like, oh, I don't know, like this. But what I want you to see of the grape leaf is this. This one, it's called the margin. The edge of the leaf is called the margin. And I want you to notice, you don't have to know all the names of the different margins, but notice this margin is totally just a line. Look at the grape leaf. The grape leaf has teeth on it like a serrated steak knife. And that's actually a margin called serrate, like a steak knife, a serrated steak knife. So I want you to look at some of these leaf margins also, but there's one other thing. Hang on, Cameron. There's one other thing I definitely want you to identify on the leaves that you look at, and I'm going to push this over slightly, and it's this part. There's veins in the leaves. Notice there are veins in the leaves, okay? Remember, we're looking at vascular plants that have the tubes inside them. That's what the veins are. And notice that, here, you can see the veins. Okay, see them back here? Okay? Now there are only 3 different types of leaf vein arrangements. If the veins all run in the same direction, like on a palm frond, they are called parallel because the veins run parallel to one another. If they have the other arrangement, there's 2 types of netted arrangements. One is if it all comes out of a main vein, it's called pinnate. And if there's several main veins that the more veins come out of, looks like fingers on the palm of your hand, it's called palmate. These are both forms of netted venation. And they're netted because they definitely look more netted than the veins in the parallel one, don't they? These would be grasses, palms, things like that. These would be your broadleafs, okay? That would be over here. I bet you if you look at it, it's going to be right here. Okay, so right now you've got about 10 minutes. Go ahead and do a rubbing on some of your leaves, or if like Maya has her leaves already done up in nice covers, you could just go ahead and put this leaf A, and then on your observations put, this has pinnate venation, and it's got the shape like kind of like a teardrop, right? And that's about all you could say about this one because you don't, oh, and that the margin looks pretty straight line, doesn't it? Okay, it doesn't look like it's got teeth or anything. But maybe some of you, yeah, you've got a grape leaf in here, so that would be your serrate. You see it looks like a steak knife, okay? All right, does everybody understand what you're doing? Yes, Delaney?
Is this leaf dying?
No, this is a croton, and this is a good point. Thank you, sweetie. Leaves can have other colors besides just chlorophyll, and crotons have a lot of different colors. The reds are usually anthocyanins. The yellows are usually carotenoids, which sounds like carrot, carotenoids, because they're the orangish and yellow pigments. But that's why up in like North Carolina in October, they get all the pretty colors on the leaves because plants can have other colors in their leaves, and when they start to die, the leaves start to die, the green disappears and you can start to see more of the other colors. But no, crotons will actually have all these pretty colors all the time. They'll also stain your clothes, just so you know. And there's purple leaves too.
Does it only have one vein? I don't see any others though.
It probably is pinnate, but you're right, it's got one main vein, but it's definitely, I would say it's pinnate. All right, and you guys feel free to use your magnifying glasses. No, that's the pigment. This is a cool leaf. The pigments in here is amazing. You got spots of chlorophyll, and then you've got red pigment, and it's a really nice pinnate as far as you're looking at the veins. A very nice example of a pinnate leaf. Delaney said she had a fuzzy leaf. Some leaves will have hair on the top. That can be dangerous. It's for protection for the leaf. Poison ivy is full of little hairs, so you want to stay away from that. And just so you know, if it has 3 leaves, it's probably poison ivy. Stay away from it. And it can be very red, it can be green, it can be brown, and even if it's been dead for a year, the oil will still cause you the same problem it will if it's brand new and fresh. So that means if you've touched it with a leather gloves or something, it's going to still be on those leather gloves a year from now. Don't touch yourself. I found all this out the hard way. Okay? Also, you don't burn it. If you burn poison ivy and breathe the smoke, it will destroy your lungs. Just like if you rubbed it on your skin, it'll tear your lungs up. And poison ivy's nasty. You know what? I'll bring you a picture of it next week. It's all over my yard, but I don't want to take the chance of bringing it in and showing you in case somebody messed up and opened it up. I'm extremely allergic. I know some people aren't. I found out the hard way that I am. I made the mistake of trying to clear our property in shorts and a bathing suit top years ago. Didn't know what poison ivy looked like, and my daughter and I just got covered. And for a month, all we did was itch. It was miserable. So I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Oh, make sure that you look at the cypress leaves. These are cypress, and they're called scaled leaves. And look at them in the magnifying glass, and you'll see how they overlap one another. Have a blessed week.